Hello and welcome to the Japan Zoomina at UC San Diego. It's the new year, so I wish you a happier new year. Akemashite omedetou gozaimasu. And yokoso to San Diego. I'm Ulrike Schede. I'm the director of JFIT, the Japan Forum for Innovation and Technology at GPS at UC San Diego. GPS stands for School of Global Policy and Strategy. We have various programs, master programs, including one with a Japan specialization. If you're interested in our programmatic offerings, please go to gps.ucsd.edu or contact me directly if you're interested in learning more about our degree programs or hiring some of our great graduate students. We have a website and a newsflash. So if you're interested in what we do, please go to jfit.ucsd.edu and you can sign up for the newsflash under news and media, and you can see current, future, and past recorded Japan Zoominars on that same website right there. All right, so it's a weekly event, and we're going to go off to start the day with the year with a forecast of what to expect with Jesper Koll, who I'll introduce in just a moment. Just a forecast here. So next week we're going to do immigration in East Asia with Erin Chung from John Hopkins, and then we'll do contemporary Japanese art with AJ Kiyoizumi, who works at Christie's New York, where she's in charge of contemporary Japanese art. In February, we'll look at the late Ezra Vogel's impact with his book, Japan is Number One, and on whether or not entrepreneurship can be taught and Japanese initiatives in fostering innovation. And with that, let me introduce Jesper. So I'll stop my share so that you can see him. Here he is. Hello, Jesper Koll in Tokyo. And everybody knows Jesper, or so it feels. So let me make a little bit of a non-standard introduction and talk about us. We both grew up about 30 miles apart in the middle of Germany. We didn't know each other then, but we met at the beginning of the bubble, I believe, like 1987, it might have been, in Tokyo. You were at John Hopkins at the time, and I think you were a kabanmochi, like a secretary, a briefcase carrier to a Japanese politician, or something like that. And then you decided that the bubble was calling, and whereas I was staying with academia, you moved to Kayabacho, which is the Wall Street in Tokyo. And I recall visiting you in your Warburg securities office. You had a tie and a suit, and all very proper, riding the bubble wave. And certainly at that time, I felt that it was call one, shade 0. You had made the right choice in riding the bubble. And so we kept meeting over the years. And the next thing I remember where I actually caught up with you was that in 1995, when you were at Merrill Lynch, you said, this year will be the year of the Japanese bureaucrat. And I held against it. And I think it's call one, shade 1 on that score, because 1995 did not turn out to be the year of the Japanese bureaucrat. Since then, you have done a number of other things, and you are now the founding CEO and senior advisor to WisdomTree Japan. You are also the senior advisor of the Monex Japan Fund, Alternative Japan Fund, something like that. And you're working with a lot of VC and PE investors. And if I had to describe you, Jesper, I would say you're actually an enabler, because you know everybody, and you know everybody in Japanese finance and business, and the bureaucrats and the politicians, also in art and in business, as already mentioned. So when people come to Tokyo to do something, they call you, and they invariably get very good advice. So thank you, Jesper, for joining me today. It's great to have you.
No, thank you very much for having me, and it's for the very kind introduction. You're right, I've been stuck in Japan since 1985, and it's been a wonderful ride and most enjoyable, and obviously it's been fantastic in sort of being at the forefront of a lot of sort of economic and policy, and also, dare I say, social developments that probably a lot of other countries are experiencing. And certainly over the last 35 years, there has never been a dull moment Japan was always in some sort of crisis, whether it was during the bubble economy, whether it was in the, so-called lost decade afterwards. But the amazing thing is that, you do have a homogeneous society with an enormous amount of purchasing power. And the one thing that you always have to point out to people is like, look, where do you find a market where there is 125, 126 million people with one of the highest per capita GDPs, in the world, and if you do have a success story here, it becomes a very, very big success story. You always have to point out that, for example, BMW, the margins of every single car it sells here in Japan is about 35% higher than anywhere else in the world because Mr. and Mrs. Watanabe, yes, are extremely rich. So that's sort of where we are. And obviously on the political side, it's always been good fun. Like you mentioned, Ulrike, I was very fortunate. The first 3 years I spent, working as Hisho, as a kabamochi for a Japanese member of parliament. And, Japanese politicians are always a lot of fun. They're very entrepreneurial. And I'm very, very glad to see that actually, with Prime Minister Suga, we actually have a true entrepreneur, who has made it to the top of his profession. I mean, as you all know, he is a self-made man. He, worked the night shift in a parcel factory here in Tokyo during his university, then made it into politics. And, for him, he always rolls up his sleeves, and no is simply not an answer. He wants to get things done. And as a result of that, it's funny because at the beginning of 2021, where we are today, he actually is beginning to scare a lot of people because he wants to get things done. He wants to hold people accountable. And as a result of that, particularly in a country like Japan, where sort of muddling through is sort of the social norm, he, as a result of that, creates a lot of enemies. And I do think that in 2021, it will be very interesting politically in Japan. As you know, there will have to be a lower house election by October this year. And, and Prime Minister Suga, as a result of that, is going to work very hard to create a feel-good factor amongst the Japanese voters.
Great. So, let's start with let me first tell the audience, we're going to have a conversation, no PowerPoints, so you can actually podcast this later if you wanted to. You can write questions in the Q&A section down there on the right-hand side of the bottom. And I will try to weave your questions into the conversation. If we don't have time to address your questions, I will review them tomorrow and make sure that that most of them get answered. So Jesper, let's start out with maybe the topic is the power of Suganomics, and later on I'm going to ask you whether you wish you had put a question mark behind that or not, because people seem to be quite negative on Suga. But let's start with the second part of the title. What do you think are the three important things to watch out for in 2021? What do you expect to see in 2021?
Yeah, no, look, I mean, I'm, relatively upbeat and optimistic on the outlook for 2021, 2022 here in Japan. And this is, from both an investor perspective, as well as from an economist and strategist perspective. And ultimately, I think there are three very important reasons for why you should look at Japan and see whether you can engage your business in Japan. And the first one is that Japan has incredible policy pragmatism. I mean, it is a bastion of stability. The Bank of Japan, the Ministry of Finance are fully coordinated in their actions. And as a result of that, you do actually find that the macroeconomic backdrop in terms of the policy side, is extremely supportive, is extremely pro-business, and that is going to continue under Prime Minister Suga and even beyond that. So policy pragmatism is the first reason. The second reason is the private sector, and it's private sector activism. And here, Ulrike, it's a little bit ironic because it looks like the COVID crisis really has become the catalyst, right, for senior management to actually change the internal culture of the firms. And as you know, you can debate the macroeconomic conditions of Japan, you can debate the industrial structure of Japan for a long time, and the conclusion will always be that we need to raise productivity. Now, how to raise productivity? A lot of the lack of productivity growth in Japan is due to entrenched, old and outdated practices of how to do business. And where where COVID has been a very good catalyst is that these outdated business practices are now broken open. The most obvious one is obviously telecommuting, right? Remote work. And it's very interesting that you've got leading companies. You've got Hitachi Corporation, you've got Fujitsu Corporation, cutting their Tokyo office space by between 25 and 30%, and actually openly encouraging everybody, to actually do home commuting as much as possible. That's just a very simple thing, right, of what's going on. But I do think that the private sector activism, right, using the COVID crisis to change the processes of business, right, that actually is a very, very big thing that makes me very, very optimistic. And look, for example, at the fact that here in Japan last year in 2020, we did actually have a record amount of management buyouts and domestic M&A activity. So this industrial consolidation that you and I have been talking about for the last, 35 years, right? Finally, this industrial consolidation is actually starting to happen. And I expect that in 2021, we're going to see more aggressive M&A activity, more aggressive management action to actually grow the businesses. And then policy pragmatism, private business activism, and then the last point is actually restructuring success. I mean, whether we like it or not, corporate Japan has actually restructured the way it does business globally very, very importantly. And the key point here is the weaning off the dependence on the United States of America. Let me give you some numbers. For listed companies, you find that 10 years ago, more than half of the profits actually came from exports or producing, in the United States of America. Now, that has actually declined to around 22, 23%, while against that, the People's Republic of China has grown from 8% to about 24%, and the rest of Asia is also at around 24%. So the point being that now, if I'm an analyst for the stock market and I need to forecast corporate profits, it's no longer, oh my God, America catches a cold, therefore Japan catches pneumonia. Now it is much more balanced, about a quarter of the profits from the US, a quarter of the profits from China, a quarter of the profits from the rest of Asia. That's a much, much more balanced structure. And as a result of that, you find that corporate Japan, in terms of the outlook for profits, and the gearing into Asia, the gearing into the People's Republic of China is doing wonders. Let me give you, Ulrike, one concrete set of numbers, because it's nice to talk in generalities. But if you look at Toyota, the profit margin of a Toyota factory in the People's Republic of China is now 3 times higher than that in a North American factory. That is tremendous in terms of what's actually been going on. So the point being that Japan has restructured its global business map, much less dependent just on the United States, much more balanced in terms of the overall dependence, between the US, China, and the rest of Asia.
Yeah, and that, of course, should be a concern for the United States, because it is quite possible that the US will be left out of the economic recovery that will soon happen in Asia, right? And so Japan and China are perfectly happy trading partners, as much as they don't like each other. But when it comes to money, pragmatism rules the game, right? So let me ask you. Let's dig a little bit. Yeah.
Go ahead. I was just going to say. I mean, look. I mean, you and I have talked about this. I mean, the density of the relationship between Japan and the People's Republic of China is just enormous. I mean, remember that China is Japan's largest trade partner, both on exports and on imports. And if you look at the spread, I mean, what type of products is it? You find that unlike the Japan relationship, the Japan-US relationship, which is very lopsided towards cars and car parts, Japan's relationship with the People's Republic of China is actually very, very broad-based, from paper cups, all the way to semiconductors. So it's very interesting. It's a very healthy and very dense relationship that you have.
Right. Let me dig a little deeper on the second point about the private sector activism. Right. So the topic of today is a sort of a forecast. So what can you name? Let's say 3 is a good number, right? 3 industrial sectors that may surprise us in 2021, either by doing extraordinarily well or by doing extraordinarily poorly.
Yeah, no, excellent. I mean, I think that, my favorite sector in terms of potential positive surprises is actually Japanese financials. And I do think that in particular, the Japanese mega banks, right? Mitsui, Mizuho, Mitsubishi, and Sumitomo Bank. And, I think that particularly the mega banks, right? Are actually ready to embark on proactive growth policies. And they're going to do so. I mean, so far, when you look at the Japanese mega banks, you always had a bit of a feel of a pity because they couldn't make money in their core business because the Bank of Japan doesn't allow them to get, interest spreads, right, and net interest margins. The domestic businesses, were always, focused on cutting costs, right? The entire fintech movement in Japan, is all about, it's not really about offering better products or cheaper products to the customer. It's all about cutting, costs at the mid and back office of the Japanese mega banks. So that's the past. I think the positive surprise from the Japanese banks, I think, is going to be with overseas acquisitions. I am convinced that 1 or 2 of the Japanese mega banks are actually going to make a sizable foray, somewhere in Asia and actually possibly in the United States of America, right? So I think that positive surprise by sector, look at the Japanese financials, the mega banks in particular, in terms of a proactive growth strategy through overseas acquisition, right? The second sector that I'm actually very, very excited about is actually the whole Japanese retail space. And the fact that everybody is now turbocharging their omni strategies, right? That you've got the bricks and mortar stores, you've got the omotenashi service, face to face with the people, but on top of that, you're actually upscaling your digital, your internet delivery system. I think that, the likes of Aeon Corporation, for example, are going to bring huge positive surprises, and I believe that in Japan, it will not be the original internet companies like Rakuten, but it will actually be the traditional bricks and mortar companies like Aeon or 7&i, that are actually going to take the internet companies to the cleaners. And then, last but not least, I do actually think that the Japanese mega conglomerates, right? When you look at particularly Hitachi, when you look at Fujitsu Corporation, I do actually think that we will see greater spin-off activity. So the focus on core businesses is going to be accelerating for some of those mega conglomerates, right? And I think that could be a great source of positive surprise coming through. And then, sorry, you said 3, but I'm going to say 4, because we do have to give kudos to our old friend Warren Buffett. I think that his bet on the Japanese trading companies, right, as a very diversified play, and ultimate a great, zero cost hedge on global inflation, I do think that the Japanese trading companies are also going to be surprising on the positive side.
Yeah, let me just give some background to that. So these trading companies are actually quite unique animals, even though we don't want to say that Japan is unique in any way. But these companies are a little bit strange because they're in some ways private equity funds because they invest like crazy, but they also own mines in Australia and LNG plants and, you know, around the world. They have shipping fleets. They one of them runs Lawson, the other one's another convenience store. So they're quite diversified, and there are 6 of them. And so the Buffett play was, my understanding is that he had $6 billion of Japanese yen-dominated bonds expire, and rather than taking them out of the country, and he wanted them in the country and wanted them safe. So what is the most diversified thing that I can buy that is not an index? And it is clearly these 6 companies, right? Because not all 6 of them will fail in all of their businesses for sure. It's the safest bet you make, so it's very clever.
Yeah, and there's one other element to it, which is that, I mean, in my day-to-day business, if you just have to forecast stock prices, right? You know, actually the trading companies trade with global inflation. You know, so if there is an uptick in global inflation, you're actually getting a free option on that. On top of that, they pay dividends of over 5%. You know, so you know, and he does have the yen bond to actually finance it. So it's actually, you know, a positive carry trade, you know, of about, you know, 450, 500 basis points. Plus you get the optionality into global inflation. So you've got the banks, you know, you've got the large conglomerates, you know, you've got the trading companies, you know, and you do have, in my opinion, the whole Japanese retail space, which I think is where the positive surprises are going to be seen. I think the negative surprises, and I hate to say this, but I do think that the negative surprises are going to be in the Japanese car company space, because I think that unfortunately, you know, the Japanese car companies are very entrenched. You know, they are not flexible. They've got their dead set focus, like Toyota now, with this dead set focus on hydrogen, hydrogen, hydrogen. And the risk is that, as you know, the hydrogen strategy could very well end up being the Betamax. You know, which, yes, the Betamax was the better technology, but it was never adopted because the rest of the world didn't adopt it. And I find it extremely hard to believe that Toyota and its hydrogen strategy is actually going to be successful in convincing the People's Republic of China, which is, after all, the most important car market in the world, to actually go all out hydrogen, when clearly the People's Republic of China's focus is on electric.
Yeah, except that I think Toyota is hedging that a little bit with its sizable bets on flying cars.
Well, this is my advice, which is interesting. My advice to the Toyota board, you know, recently was, you know, like, look, if we are going to have in 2021 the Olympics, right? How about you pick up the gold medalists at the track and field events in a flying car and fly them out of the stadium? I mean, you will have the eyes of the next future generation. This is better than the Shinkansen in 1964. If Japan can do flying cars at the 21 Olympics, we're going good.
Yeah, and just so that you know, I don't know whether the entire audience is aware of this, but Toyota has actually invested in 2 separate flying car projects. And a flying car, think of it as a drone that's big enough to have a person in it, or a helicopter that has these drone-like horizontal rotating things. And the first test drive, is it a drive or a flight? A test drive flight with a person in it was done in August last year, and the person landed and is alive and well. And so this is all actually there, right? The technology is there. And so,
no, but think about it. And, but you make the important point. I mean, the important point is it's not about self-driving cars. I mean, I once had an argument with you know, Mr. Musk, you know, saying like, look, you talk about self-driving cars. You're in Tokyo. Tokyo has self-driving cars. It's called a subway. You know, and of course you can imagine, you know, what sort of happened. But look, I mean, the reality is, I mean, self-driving cars. Yes, I get all of that, right? Particularly in the Japanese countryside, that's obviously very helpful. But as long as you stick to 2 dimensions, nothing fundamentally changes. If you go into the 3rd dimension, i.e. flight, right, then it gets interesting. And Japan certainly is the kind of country where the regulatory framework, right, building the rules and the rules of the air, the rules of the air roads, you know, Japan could definitely set an example on how to go about things. So dreaming big, I think, is one of the things, and I wish, you know, you're right. I mean, obviously, Toyota being a massive company, you know, there's nothing that they don't do. But the question for me is, what do you do aggressively and what do you do right? And I'm just a little bit worried that there is not enough focus, you know, in the Japanese car companies in general to actually compete with the rest of the world, which is extremely focused and very aggressive.
So on this point, John has a question about the competition with China. Is China going to eat Japan's cake? And there's a longer story there that I want to add on to that while you think about this. So in my recent book, I talk about, so I have this line that slow is good, right? So Japanese change is very slow, and that enables society to stay stable and the crime rate to stay low, and you know, all of these wonderful things. But Curtis at Columbia looked at me and said, well, when is slow too slow, right? And so John's question on China reminded me of my own question here. And when is slow too slow? I mean, is China going to just own the electric car industry if Japan doesn't grab it, and if Toyota just goes with the hydrogen, and Honda is kind of having a hard time to decide, and that sort of thing. So what's the situation there? What's your
No, look, I mean, the point is obviously extremely valid, you know, and I think there is no question that, you know, the trade and the competition with the People's Republic of China has long moved on from being complementary to being extremely competitive. And that is true across the board. And quite frankly, there are some industries where Japan doesn't even register. You know, for example, if you look at the entire space of software development, you know, outside of some specific local project here in Galapagos, Japan, you know, outside of those projects, I mean, the Japanese software development companies are just nowhere, you know, and will never be able to compete, you know, with anything that is coming out of the United States or out of the People's Republic of China. You know, now, if you look at some other industries, you've got to be very, very specific, right? I think that, you know, in the car space, obviously, there is, you know, competition that is there. If you look at the entire machinery sector, right, slowly but surely, obviously, you know, the race to the top, you know, is something that the Japanese have to be very good at. And in the machinery sector specifically, the Japanese companies have been fantastic. Because it was very easy to say that, oh, look at agricultural machinery. The Chinese are going to eat the Japanese lunch, you know, within 10 years. But look at what Kubota, you know, what Komatsu, you know, what the Japanese machinery companies have been doing. They are the #1 and preferred choice by far, you know, of anybody in the People's Republic of China who runs a farm or a mine. So it's quite interesting, right? I'm not saying that it's competition, so it will continue. But, you know, for all intents and purposes, the incredible density and the incredible depth of interaction that the Chinese companies, that the Japanese companies have within the People's Republic of China, that depth and breadth, right, you know, is actually second to none relative to the other G7 countries. And, you know, they are very, very entrenched. So, for example, if you want to do an excellent exercise, have a look at Kubota, the agricultural machinery company from Japan, at their marketing strategy in the People's Republic of China. And you find that that is a preferred and very good amakudari, descent from heaven, place for former members of the Communist Party in the Chinese regions. So they're very, very clever in terms of actually building a dense relationship with the People's Republic of China. So will there be continued competition? Absolutely. The question, of course, is, you know, next global standards, like, you know, whether it's hydrogen cars or whether it's flying cars, where will those standards be set? Is it going to be unilaterally by the Middle Kingdom of China, or is it going to be, you know, by Japan? You know, that's the big question here. And it's interesting, actually. We had this discussion recently at the Prime Minister's office. I mean, jokingly, I sort of said, well, what was the last global standard that Japan set? It was the fax machine. But, sorry, that's half joking, obviously. There are many, many precision industries or medical device industries where Japan very, very actively does set the global standard, right? But in terms of mass market consumer products, right, I think that you will probably never see the Japanese resetting the standard again.
But it's also important to understand, I think, that we tend to overestimate how far China has come in terms of the tip of the R&D edge, or the frontier, if you wish. And I think we tend to underestimate how innovative large Japanese companies are. There's a lot of conversation about Japan doesn't have, entrepreneurship, and it doesn't have startup companies, which I think is misguided. But it also distracts from the fact that there are a large number of Japanese companies, whether that's NEC or Hitachi or Mitsubishi Heavy or Toyota, that are developing new things. They're not standing still. They're not waiting for China to arrive and then they say, "Ooh, there's China." They're developing new things, and so it's a competitive situation. But it's not as if there's this big China wave that's coming and Japan is defenseless. I mean, and I agree with you that relationship is becoming more and more symbiotic. Right?
No, and look, and this is where it obviously gets very interesting, and where ultimately, the role of the United States, sort of does become very, very important. If you look at medical devices, for example, right? Japan, is absolutely dominant in many of the medical devices. Now, there's lots of good R&D, there's lots of good implementation inside the People's Republic of China, but I find it hard to believe that in the current conditions, right, that Western, dare I say, hospitals are going to opt, for Chinese, medical devices, right? So that's where, obviously the whole, the specter of this tech war, right, is obviously something that is very, very high. Now, having said this, there has been a change under the Abe administration, and Prime Minister Suga is continuing with that, which is that this newfound focus on national security concerns, right, that you do proactively try to protect and to fence off and cordon off domestic industries, from supposedly unfair, competition in the name of national security. As you know, that is something that has changed profoundly in Japan over the last couple of years, not just with the introduction of the Gaitameho of the foreign exchange law, with restrictions of what foreign investors can actually do with Japanese companies, but even deeper into that, when you look at some of the export licensing and import licensing, that is actually starting to be going on there. So, in terms of, yes, the competition with the People's Republic of China is going to continue to grow. One of the new developments is that the administrative state in Japan, in the name of national security, is actually now starting to circle the wagons, so to speak, a little bit, right? And that's something that we need to look at very, very carefully over the next couple of years, whether that's going to be accelerating or whether some form of new multilateralism can actually be forged again.
So we got some questions on COVID, and it's the obvious topic. You're sitting at home, your izakaya, your favorite restaurant closes at 8. It's not good, but there, we've had on this Zoominar previous speakers who have all also spoken to how this moment of crisis is actually a chance it's at the same time a chance to change something or accelerate ongoing change, but it's also a threat, for instance, for young people that are looking for jobs and that sort of thing, right? So I saw you regularly write opinion pieces in the Japan Times, and a recent one, you talked about how Japanese industry is very fragmented, and you looked at the number of sectors and found that in many industries, the top 4 market share is something like 11%, which means there's like too many, excess competition, the old concept that we always had to laugh about when we first heard it. And so in the United States, usually the top four have something like 35%, maybe, at least in the large industries, right? So your op-ed piece was about how great it is that this pandemic gives us an opportunity to clean this out a little bit. But I'm wondering how that actually looks in terms of the social costs. I mean, it'd be easy to say for an economist to say, oh, great, creative destruction. Let's just kill all of these, tatami makers and all of this, and these little guys. But then somebody has to take care of them, right? There, and in the old Japan, of course, the large companies were in charge of corporate welfare, and they would provide lifetime employment and then long-term exclusive supplier relations, which meant lifetime employment for the workers at the suppliers. And so everything was kind of, the water levels were rising and everybody was happy, and that's no longer there. So what is your vision on how Japan can use the COVID situation to clean up some of this, but what's the vision there for how to deal with the, well, shall we call them losers? The ones that get the short end of the stick.
No, but look, I mean, this is a very, very important point, and you are ironically, Ulrika, I think you're actually at a sweet spot, in the sense of that the age of the people, in the zombie companies, right? Well, 10 years ago, the average age of a shacho, was around 65. Well, now it's 75. And I mean, there comes a point that even when the Japanese, are no longer capable, of functioning in the economic sense, right, in terms of age, right? And so I think that you're actually, yes, the social cost in terms of bankruptcies, raising employment, leading to income losses of people that you cannot retrain or cannot expect to be retrained and go elsewhere. That economic cost is obviously still there, but it's much less mitigated, relative to other societies that are much, much younger. Because, if you look at the strata, and I know you've done a lot of work of that, if you look at the SMEs, the small and medium-sized companies, yes, there are too many of them. Yes, there is excessive competition, but if you look at the age structure, you actually do see, that they are now the gerontocracy. And I do think that the Corona crisis is actually the catalyst, to let go and lead about that industrial restructuring. And by the way, Prime Minister Suga is very focused on that. One of his big things is indeed the fact that Japan does have excessive competition. That the excessive competition, is actually giving rise to a structural disinflation that you have, right? Because the marginal, little guy, the moment you and I come up with a new product that is better and more sexy, the marginal little guy will copy us, within 6 months, and basically do the same thing, but offer it for a lower marginal cost, right? So it's very interesting, that the focus of the Prime Minister is there, and that at the same time, you do have this demographic sweet spot, if I dare say it, right? Where you do actually have, the old generation coming through. Let me give you one concrete example, which is just fun. When you look at the wholesale sector, right, you find that Japan has 368,000 wholesalers. Of those 368,000 wholesalers, 2/3 do not have a customer who is a producer or a retailer. So in other words, 2/3 of all of Japanese wholesalers are a middleman to another middleman. Now, these are going to go. Now, the average age of a CEO of a Japanese wholesaler is now 74. So again, this is a sweet spot, right, where a company like, for example, Amazon, right, or a company like Aeon, right, can actually break into and actually consolidate the businesses, quite nicely.
Well, it's funny. I'm actually working on a manuscript right now where we talk about the lucky moment.
There you go, the lucky moment.
The lucky moment, right? The sweet spot, the lucky moment. That it's the digital disruption happens at the same time as the sort of the aging and the demographic change, and then you bring this together, it actually opens up an opportunity to pull this out. I think you just froze. I don't think we have you right here, but maybe you can hear us. I hope you can. in the off chance that that we've lost Jesper, I should just maybe ad-lib a little bit. I'll take some questions and see what we can. I guess we lost our speaker. So there is a question about Suga-san that we will need Jesper for. But let me just talk a little bit more about this lucky moment, because I've had a long conversation with Jesper about this, and I'm sure I'll come back in shortly. So the lucky moment idea is that that the digital disruption is going to bring some changes that he was just talking about, like Eon and 7-Eleven are going to grab this moment. And great, there you are. I'm just explaining the lucky moment again. And because there is a labor shortage due to the aging society soon to set in, Japanese are more likely to embrace the digital disruption in ways that allows this transition. Jesper, you're muted, so if you want to rejoin us, if you could unmute yourself, that'd be great. So I would just talk more a little bit about the labor shortage. You looked pretty bad, and then came COVID, and now. So I want to go back to the question about are the young people in Japan stuck right now? What's happened? I mean, it's great to have the work from home and the hataraki kata kaikaku, which is the labor reform, and everything is loosening up a little bit. But what about the young people? And then there's the second question about the Japanese consumption. And this is a long-standing sort of stereotype that the Japanese save a lot. And in a crisis, they would probably save more. So what are your thoughts on sort of the part of Japanese society that is actually not on this, in the sectors that you just described?
Look, I mean, it's very interesting. I mean, we've got this cyclical development right now with, basically the number of unemployed up by about 2 million people, relative to a number of employed of around 60 million people. So there's obviously a cyclical shock that you have there, right, with the usual, repercussions that's going on. But make no mistake, I want to be reborn as a 23-year-old Japanese. I mean, the number of university graduates is dropping every year. So it's my call, it's my prize. And, Hitachi Corporation is bidding for me, and it's my demands. And when you look at the quality of contracts, right, it's very interesting, even through this COVID crisis. Obviously, you had, the hit being taken by the part-time employees, by the Arbaito, by the Heisei Sha, but you actually find that on the recovery side over the last 4 months, you actually saw that full-time employment outpaced part-time employment job creation. And so that those people who do get hired actually do get way better contracts. And I think that, this, because of the structural shortage of labor, is going to continue. There's obviously going to be a bifurcation. And the real question is the question of skill. And this is where Japan has a lot of work to do. We talked earlier about software. And I mean, the reality is, that here you've got a prime minister who's talking about DX, about the digital ministry and all of that. But you've got a country where the total number of AI-capable software engineers is less than the AI-capable software engineers that Google employs globally. I mean, this is terrible. And, the urgency for upskilling of the young generation, right? And, of course, the urgency of retraining of some of the engineers in their 30s and 40s, that urgency is absolutely tremendous, and unfortunately not enough is being done about that, right? So I think, overall, I think you will find, if and when, things begin to normalize and the vagaries of, 3 months lockdown, 3 months no lockdown, blah, 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 the moment things become predictable again, I do think that you will find that the participation rates in Japan will be increasing very rapidly again, and that the unemployment rate, the structural lows of somewhere between 1.5% and 2% on the unemployment rate, you get back down there very, very quickly.
So I think we see that a little bit. I mean, so some of the university students that I'm having now here, and also see when I go, when I will be able once again to go to Tokyo, are changing. I mean, at the high end, there is clearly an understanding that what you just said, if I work hard and if I know this stuff, I will, you know, it's going to be good. Right. And so then the question is, how can the bottom be raised a little bit? On this counter, what you just said, we have two questions. Nobuo and Jennifer both are pushing us to talk a little bit about gender balance. You know, are the women be hit again because the kids are not in school and there's no daycare and all of that? And then just a larger topic, not just women, but whatever the minorities are, the people that are not in the mainstream. Right? So isn't this bifurcation of the industry that we're implicitly talking about here, right? That is that, you know, some people talk about the K recovery and the great sectors and the losing sectors, and so isn't it, what can Japan do? Nobuo wants to know, to do more about gender balance and not let COVID, you know, sort of become a big setback.
Look, I mean, there's 1,000 ways to think about this, right? But I mean, you know, my point on this has always been that you know, the single biggest obstacle is the internal culture of the majority of the firms, which pays on the basis of seniority rather than on the basis of performance. You know, so, you know, why is it so difficult for Japanese females to come back, you know, into the workforce after they've had a child? You know, a big reason is because, you know, how can you have lateral entry, right, into a system that is effectively an escalator type system where, you know, you've all of a sudden missed, you know, 10 years or whatever it is. I don't want to, there's lots of social and anthropological and other things that we can talk about there, but in economic terms, right, Japan's corporations are closed to outsiders because they do not pay and remunerate on the basis of performance. That's true for gaijin. You know, if you're a foreigner, right, if you're an engineer from MIT and you get a job offer from Apple, Siemens, and Canon Corporation, you know, you'd be crazy to go to Canon, because at Apple Corporation, if you're good and lucky, in 10 years, you can run the company. At Siemens, if you're good and lucky, in 10 years, you can run a region of the world. At Canon, if you're good and lucky, what's it going to be? Section chief? Project manager? I mean, you know, the Japan's problem and Japan's beauty is the fact that the A team, right, does not want to join Japanese corporations. That's the real problem. That's true for women, that's true for foreigners, and that's true for men. And when you talk about discrimination, you know, I'm happy to. Kathy is sitting next door, so you can talk to my wife about womenomics and all of that stuff. You know, but I've always made the argument that actually the biggest discrimination in Japan, you know, is against youth. Because a capable, you know, engineer, a capable designer, a capable salesperson who is 20 years old or 28 years old can never be put in charge of a team where the average age is 38 years old. And that's a form of discrimination, and that's ultimately a form of disincentive, right? You know, that is, you know, ultimately the one, in my personal opinion, big holdback that you have against productivity growth in the country. It is the fact that you do not know how to translate empowerment into the Japanese language. I mean,
yeah, there is no Japanese word for that, right? That's the current thing. So it's a very important point. The youth are discriminated against, and it's not gender so much, actually. It's actually anybody under the age of what, 45 or something, right?
No, but look, I mean, the old are scared, right? And look, I mean, I always have to point out, you know, when foreign funds come and visit Japan, and you have the sort of the usual lunch or dinner meetings, right? you know, they always obviously come with an Israeli concept, or with a German concept, or with an American concept, yada-da. That's normal, right? Everybody has their little biases. But the number one thing when you come to Japan, you've got to realize is that pretty soon, in a couple of years, 1 in 4 people is going to be over the age of 70. And that's neither a good thing nor a bad thing. It's a reality. Now, these people are incredibly rich. This is the richest baby boom generation on earth. But their consumer preferences, their speed of development, etc., are going to be very different from that you have at a younger society. And it's funny, people always make jokes and they say, oh, look, Japan, it's terrible. You know, they sell more adult diapers than baby diapers. Isn't that terrible? And the answer is no, it's actually fantastic, because the profit margin on an adult diaper is twice as high as it is on a baby diaper. Because trust me, if I'm 65 and I need a diaper, it better sit snug. No, sorry, it's a joke. It's a joke, but it's trying to point out a reality. So, for example, when some of these tech guys come over, you know, what should you do in Japan? It's like, okay, you talk about digitalization. Digital skilling in Japan is, how do I deal, right? How do I deal with 1 in 4 people who's over 70, of which 10% have a high probability of getting dementia or Alzheimer within the next 5 years? How can I set up a individual banking system, right, that actually allows for those people to still conduct their banking services, solve that problem? I don't need betterment. I don't need, you know, a robo advisor to tell me how to do things. I need an app that actually allows a person with Alzheimer, right, to still conduct part of their banking system.
Yeah, and or, you know, if you talk to people at some of the electronics companies like Panasonic or Sony or something, lead a life, right? You know, the one big remote governs the entire house. You know, one thing does it all, and it's cognitively efficient and all of that. And so I agree with that completely. It's a great market, and that's where the money is. I looked at a number of rich people in various countries in the world. It's a difficult number to find, right? Because it's a survey of you know, financial managers, and is it complete? No, but there's no reason to think that it would be biased towards or against Japan in any way. And what I learned is that there are these so-called high net worth individuals, right? There are 5.6 million high net worth individuals in the United States, people that have $10 million in their bank account free to invest, not counting the house and the car and jewelry and nothing like that, just the cash. Mm-hmm. And so 5.6 million in the United States, 3.2 million in Japan. Yep. Number 3 rich country is Germany with 1.6 million. That is where the rich baby boomers are, because that money is sitting there and it's waiting to be deployed, right? And so there's this Kyushu, JR Kyushu has this train that goes around Kyushu, and it costs $10,000 a week, and you can go through Kyushu in an old, like an Oriental Express sort of type train. It's $10,000 for a week of vacationing. It's fantastic. Right? There's a lot of money to be made in Japan, I guess. So yes, but we haven't talked about Mr. Suga yet, and yet the topic of our conversation here is the power of Suganomics, and we have a lot of questions about Suga. I have a political system question, and it's really, is this all a kabuki or what's going on? Because when Abe was on his way out, everybody was saying, well, there's a strong man Suga, and there was even a conspiracy theory that they were kicking Abe out because his rankings were bad or whatever. And so there was this story that Suga was behind the wheels when Abe was kicked out, and now Suga is in the driver's seat. And no sooner has that happened that, first of all, his ratings plummet, and second, there is a story that Nikkei now wants to kick him out. And so is this just a musical chair thing, or do these prime ministers in Japan not have power? Or why are people so unhappy with Suga? What's going on with Suga?
No, look, I mean, there's again, you know, many different ways of going at that. You know, and I think that it's not a coincidence that Prime Minister Abe announced his resignation one day after he became the longest serving prime minister which his great uncle, was before. So I think that there's a degree of tiredness, there's a degree of after 8 years in power, but there's also a form, that needs to be preserved. But I think that let's talk about Suga, because what people don't, Suga is feared. Do not forget that Suga is the author of what, in my opinion, institutionally, is the single most important change that we've seen in Japanese, recent administrative history, which is that, they have, in 2014, they instigated at the Prime Minister's office the senior ministerial jinjibu. The personnel decisions of the senior bureaucracies, Kyokcho, Director General and above, is now appointed explicitly by the Prime Minister's office. And it was Suga who did that. So basically every year there's give or take 600 senior bureaucrats appointments that have to be ratified. And it's not just rubber stamped anymore, but they actually have to be approved. And so under Suga, right, who was, as the Kambochokan, was in charge of that, right? Under Suga, you've seen for the first time ever in the post-war history, you've seen in the major ministries, people elevated to positions, right, that went beyond seniority. So at METI, you had a couple of, director generals that were younger than their predecessor and younger than the people that they were the boss of. It's a meritocracy that Suga introduced. Now, if you appoint 600 or so senior bureaucrats, that kind of means you don't appoint about 3,000 senior bureaucrats. So you've got a lot of enemies, right? Let me tell you another thing what Suga did. People don't know in terms of economic impact, the Furusato Nose, where my local inhabitants tax can be rechanneled into different regions, right? Prime Minister Suga was the author of doing that. And you can imagine, again, how many enemies you make in what I think is one of the most effective, redistribution policies in terms of regional development, that we've seen anywhere in the world. Prime Minister Suga, against many enemies, is the author of that. Right now, Prime Minister Suga is, again, very good at making enemies, because as you may know, the LDP has a rule which is never enforced, which is that in the elections, and in the elections for the lower house, you've got first around the post direct mandates, and then you've got the list proportional mandates. And you can stand in both areas, right? You can stand in your local district and you can be on the list, which is done with some people so that they're sure that if they don't make it in the local district, they still stay within, within parliament. But there's a rule in the LDP that says you can do this only 2 times. If 3 times you have not won in your local district, but only because of the grace of the proportional list, right? Then you can no longer run in both. You have to win in the local area. And Prime Minister Suga, for this upcoming election, is putting down his foot and laying down the law, right? And of course, again, this, pisses off, annoys a lot of senior LDP politicians, because it effectively means the easy ride is over. If you can't win in your local district, you are not worthy of being a politician. So what I'm trying to say is, this is the kind of guy Suga is. He rolls up his sleeves. He wants to get things done. He assumes that you take responsibility. I've been in the room when he demoted a senior bureaucrat because he didn't do what he was asked to do in the previous meeting. So he exercises power, and that's why the knives are coming out.
So does he do that in a kind way, or is he just really tough?
What do you mean in a kind way? It's like in the sense of, does he follow through? If you're asked, right? This was some shingikai, right? It was like something. Can you prepare a report on this? Right? It was like some. I forget what the topic was, and the bureaucrat basically didn't prepare the right report. He sort of skid it around, right? He said, "Well, this is not what we asked for. You're fired." I mean, sorry, he didn't quite say it that way, obviously. Is it in a kind way? But it is interesting. You remember Prime Minister Abe made a speech that was controversial in US Congress, and he said, Tina, there is no alternative, right? Japan has got to act, right? And Prime Minister Suga is exactly of that mindset. You know, he assumes responsibility. He wants people to empower. He empowers people, wants them to assume responsibility. And if they don't follow up, you have to live with the consequences, which, as you know, is not the Japanese way of doing business. It's not wow, right? So it's quite interesting.
So why do people not like him?
Why do people not like him? I think that, you know, because again, if you are, you know, actually, I mean, there's a lot of people who do like him, first of all, right? You know, particularly, you know, if you look at young entrepreneurs, right? You know, if you look at self-made business people, right? They have an enormous amount of respect for him and give a lot of support for him. The people who don't like him are the people from the larger, more established, you know, enterprises and business associations, right? Because they prefer to do it Nippon-gata, right? I mean, he is not Nippon-gata, he is Dokushinsha.
Right. So, so the power of Suganomics. So you think he'll push it through this year?
Look, I mean, I think it's very interesting because at the end of the day, you know, we can talk about, you know, whether, my God, if your popularity goes from 70%, which was weirdly high, you know, down to 40%, is that a big shock or not? Look, I mean, this COVID thing and, you know, the fear that, you know, people have over what should be done against COVID or what should not be done, we shall see. You know, personally, I think that, you know, by the end of February, beginning of March, Japan is going to start the vaccination programs. They're going to be later than many of the other industrialized countries, right? But I do think I've got certainly high hopes that the logistics of getting the vaccination, you know, spread relatively quickly. I think that that's going to lift, you know, his fortunes in the fight against COVID. But the more important thing to consider is that we can talk about Suga, but at the end of the day, every prime minister is only as strong or as weak as his challenger is strong or weak. And right now, there is absolutely no challenger. I mean, Nikai is a lot of things, but he's not a challenger. You know, Ishiba, you know, who was the biggest challenger, you know, basically has resigned from this. So for all intents and purposes, right now, the reality of the LDP is that it is as rudderless as the general state of the opposition parties here in Japan. So I think that the fact that there is no alternative to Suga, right, I think at the end of the day makes it very likely, in my opinion, that come September, he will be re-elected as LDP president, and that, you know, we will see a lower house election where the LDP is once again going to come relatively close, you know, to the 2/3 supermajority.
Yeah, there's also, we need to remember that these ratings in Japan are to be read very differently from the United States. I mean, so a 40% support rate in Japan is actually not that bad by Japanese standards.
Absolutely. I mean, it gets very, it would get interesting. I mean, if you're basically the threshold, as you know very well, if you skirt, you know, below 30% for a couple of months, you know, consecutively, and there's no improvement, then you would start to have a problem, right? But again, you know, it was very clear right from the beginning that he would not call an early election, you know, because again, he himself, in my personal opinion, he himself wants to be re-elected on merit, not on the spur of the moment, which was the fact, you know, which was the case after he took over from Abe.
Well, what can I say? I could go on for hours, but time is up. We're over time. We're not losing any of the audience. I'm sure they would also like to go on, but I don't want to tax you more than necessary. Thank you, Jesper, for taking an hour out of your busy day.
But come and visit. I mean, these are extraordinary, interesting time, and I think that, you know, really the investment opportunity and the economic opportunities here are vastly underestimated. And I think that, Corona as a catalyst for faster decision-making, for more rational decision-making on the part of Japanese leadership, I think we're going to see. And I think you will find pretty soon that it's not just SoftBank that can make aggressive decisions, but even some of the stale Japanese mega banks are capable of going big.
I completely agree with you. I think there's a lot of interesting stuff happening in Japan right now. It's not as flashy as it might be in the United States, but that doesn't mean it's not there. And it may not be as fast as elsewhere, but that doesn't mean it's stagnant. So there's lots of stuff happening in Japan. And thank you, Jesper, for explaining it. And it's great to have had you here. And thank you, audience, for all of your questions. I'll take a look and I'll send them to Jesper tomorrow. You can take a look. Thank you very much for joining us. And we'll see you again next week at 4:30 on Tuesday afternoon with Aaron Chan talking about grassroots effort and how they make a difference in the reality of immigration policies. So thank you, everybody. Thank you. Stay safe. Be careful. And I'll see you next week. Thank you, Jasper.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.